to Housmans Bookshop, who have very kindly donated this space to let me run this Autonomy Now project. All credit to them for doing it. Now, some housekeeping things. If there's a fire, the only exit's that way. The loo, don't go anywhere else because that's the only place. The loo is just back there and it's a set of steps on the right hand side. Anything else? Just a couple of quick announcements. Eventually, there will be a website for this project, and it will be under the title Autonomy Now, and it will be autonomynow.org. Also, another couple of quick announcements. On the, I don't know if anybody went to the Anarchist Festival that occurred last year in October, where it was a kind of replacement for the Anarchist Book Fair. It happened in several small venues. It was so successful, and it was Housmans that organised it actually. I mean, all I did was I said, Nick, we've got to do something. And Nick picked it up and said, okay, let's do it. It really was like pushing an open door. And it was so successful at doing one this year as well, but earlier in the year. And that's going to start on the 31st of May, and it's going to end on the 2nd of June. And I wanted to do it nationally. So anarchist things are here, UK, Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales. The deadline for anybody wanting to do anything at it is going to be on May the 1st. So if you get any ideas, get them in as quickly as possible. It's the same website address as was used last year, but I'll just repeat it again. It's anarchistfestival.wordpress.com, and there's also a Facebook page plus a Twitter handle for it, a Twitter account for it as well. What can I say? We've got two veterans here, anarchy veterans. What more can I say than that? I should just leave it there, but I'm just going to say another few things on it. Tony, who's doing the talk tonight, is the publisher of Mail and Press. If anybody's not heard of it, do check out the website. We also have full stock of all this stuff right at the back of the shop, so it's worth it actually checking out as well. This is part of a series of the first book of 4 that Tony's doing on history of anarchy plus various other things. So I've actually read this, and it's actually quite a good book. There's a lot of good read details that people can pick up on it. And it's titled Anarchist Perspectives in Peace and War from 1900 to 1918. The second edition is going to be covering the 1920s, so do keep an eye on his website for whenever that comes out. My friend Carl Levy, professor of these sorts of things in Goldsmith College, he's got 2 books coming out, and he's going to be doing a talk for us later in the year. He's got there'll be about 2 different books. He's got one is out already, and the other one comes out in April. The one that's out has been out for a few months ago, and it's the Palgrave Handbook of Anarchism. It's heavy duty stuff, but there is interesting stuff in it. But I'm sure there's certain places online you can download copies of it as well, because it's quite pricey. The second book that he's doing... Unless you're a library. Yeah, exactly. It's the second book, the book that he's got coming out in April is The Anarchist Imagination, and that's done with Solnium as well. And once that comes out, he'll be doing the talk. That's Routledge. And that's by Routledge. We've also got other really interesting speakers in this series. We've got in the next month or so we're going to have what's her name again? Murray Bookchin's daughter, Debbie Bookchin. She's going to be doing a talk here about a title called Fearless Cities, and then she's going to tie it into Rojava and her father Murray Bookchin. And then we're also going to have Judith Suissa. She's going to be talking about anarchy in education, and she's really good in that sort of stuff. So can I hand you over to these 2 desperados over here, and give a hand for Tony and Carol. And I'll be up at the front.
Hi. Well, thank you for coming on such a cold evening, and thank you for Housmans for hosting this. Does this book have any relevance to the present or the future? Maybe. If one travels back in time to the 1900s, many people were saying we can keep our economy going and do it better than capitalism, with unions providing a matrix for cooperatives and collectives running industry and businesses. So perhaps this is a message that still resonates a little today. One of the main episodes in this book concerns the Anarchist Congress that took place in 1907 in Amsterdam. It was a singular event before the First World War. It brought together anarchists and revolutionary socialists. The orientation of German social democracy, which was then the leading force in international organisations of the labour movement, unions and parties, had repelled many activists from those organisations. So much of the force of syndicalism came from that movement and became sympathetic to anarchism. Critics focused on the failure of German social democracy to organise against militarism, the militarism of the then German state, and against the illusion that it would fall apart, and were repelled by the idea that Labour would become passively the leading force through a German parliamentary system. Several activists had been expelled from the German Social Democratic Party and came to Amsterdam. One of these was Dr. Friedeberg of the Free Association of German Labour Unions, the FVDG. The unions, aligned with the Social Democrats, obeyed government rules that banned discussion of politics in national German unions. The FVDG unions, however, frequently designated as loyalists, used a loophole in German legislation which allowed local organisations to talk about politics. Dr. Friedeberg presented critical views of German social democracy and sponsored a resolution that criticised their concept of a general strike to widen the electoral franchise. A man from Rome, Ceccarelli, representing the Argentinian Regional Federation of Labour, the FORA, also commented that although his federation was working for libertarian communism rather than state-run nationalised socialism, many FORA members still had electoral illusions. One of the Dutch organisers of the Congress, Christiaan Cornelissen, remarked that in some countries, including the Netherlands, the UK, the USA and Switzerland, there were political problems within the labour movement that gave rise to more radical labour organisations. He mentioned the exclusion of Japanese workers from the American Federation of Labour. In the US there was considerable anti-Japanese prejudice, but this was resisted by the IWW, the Wobblies. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, accepted Japanese workers while the American Federation of Labour did not. Cornelissen also remarked that in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, unions obstructed women from becoming typographers. Emma Goldman was one of the very few women who were present at the Amsterdam Congress. One of the largest speeches, one of the longest speeches at the Congress, was from Pierre Monatte, a very young member of the French General Confederation of Labour, the CGT. The CGT had recently adopted a charter, the Charter of Amiens, which set out that in leading labour, the CGT was sufficient unto itself. The CGT embraced the politics of anti-militarism and the politics of direct action, which included strikes, boycotts and sabotage. But disputes over electoral politics was something that was not wanted in the CGT. 2 years later, the two CGT members, Émile Patot and Émile Pouget, wrote a book on how they imagined a revolution might break out, which I think has been available in Housmans, probably still is. So this book, and thank you.
Was it Pluto Press?
Yeah, How We Shall Bring Out a Revolution, was published around about 1907. Another CGT activist, George Yvetot, had written A Soldier's Manual, a text that challenged nationalism and patriotism. This was a book designed to support young men forced to join the French army. It was translated into Spanish and circulated in Spain and in Latin America. It was probably the inspiration for a similar work, A Soldier's Breviary, which was circulated by German libertarians. So some political ideas and campaigns were articulated within the CGT. Nevertheless, Pierre Monatte insisted that the strength of the CGT lay in its direct action and its devolved and federal unity, in the fact that for each trade or industry and for each town or region there was only one federation organising labour. The CGT strived to build solidarity, and some solidarity in and beyond the workplace. And it was seen as the force energising change, while disputes over electoral or anarchist politics might weaken the movement. So, in this view of politics, the strength and energy of the CGT lay in its comprehensiveness and in its unity. Pierre Monatte spoke for political neutrality in this sense. He hoped that the CGT was moving forward and would embrace a wider range of politics and become a leading force in French society. But one might say that it was a moot point as to what politics was wanted and what was not wanted. A reply to this rather long speech was made by Errico Malatesta, an anarchist veteran who had attended libertarian congresses for over 30 years. He noted the points made by Cornelissen, that Labour contained a variety of influences, that it contained both roses and thorns, so to speak. He made a characteristic comment that everyday workplace organisation, one might say workplace syndicalism, was a fact, but the theory of what we might call syndicalism as an ideology was not a fact, and he opposed syndicalism as an ideology. Errico Malatesta doubted the idea that CGT syndicalism, as portrayed by Monatte, had such force and preparation as to shape change. He thought that an isolated general strike would not work. In any case, autonomy had to be kept going in the event of a general strike, albeit with perhaps new norms and priorities. He expected that a strike would not remain peaceful, that the government would try to use force, and that Labour must prepare and have counterforce ready. For Malatesta then, political will and determination and other preparations were needed in addition to those made within workplace unions, and these might be best managed through some structure other than a union or syndicate, an ideas-based organisation or anarchist federation. The Congress agreed a resolution that defined syndicates as organisations of class struggle working for improvements of conditions, but also as producers' unions, which were to serve to help transform capitalism and facilitate the emergence of an anarchist communist society. So these then are some of the ideas and themes that emerged in Amsterdam. They were not magic formulas or easy solutions to every social ill, but they encapsulated libertarians' hopes and perspectives at a time when there was considerable optimism. Subsequent events would test these ideas. Within 10 years, new and large syndicalist federations emerged in Italy and Spain. The comprehensive radical syndicalism that existed in France was split by the antagonisms that emerged in 1914. In 1915, in Argentina, the regional federation that embraced syndicalism split, with some syndicalists remaining somewhat neutral and others determined to assert forthrightly an anarchist identity and a finality, the goal of libertarian communism. In each of these cases, the comprehensive syndicalism that Monatte had advocated was somewhat fractured. Various forms of revolutionary and radical syndicalism emerged. These labour confederations promoted Labour confederations promoted libertarian ideas, and they were enhanced by new and challenged by new ideas-based organisations, that is to say, new anarchist federations. In the period before the First World War, there were few organised anarchist federations. The French anarchist organisation emerged only in 1912-1913. So there was very little time to consider what the relationship might be between, on the one hand, workplace organisations, and on the other hand, ideas-based organisations. So in the future, new areas of political debate emerged concerning different forms of organisation in the workplace or around political ideas. That maybe will be the theme of the next volume in the 1920s. So, thanks.
Tony told me you wanted to talk about things, how they're relevant today, as far as I understand. So it's going to pick up on Malatesta, who was born in 1853 and died in 1932. And he came out of this background of the Italian national unification movement of Risorgimento generation afterwards, really. Disenchanted left wing, the left wing of it, you might say, which became Italian anarchism in the 1870s. And these people tried to actually mount a series of social insurrections based on land reform, in some ways foreshadowing Guevara, in some way, going up in the mountains, establishing liberated zones and going on from there, which is not completely incredible in Italy, given the fact that the entire South collapsed by the invasion of 1,005 people, that is Garibaldi's, with the help of the British Navy, I must say, but that's another story, playing of one power against another. But after that, once he went into exile, and he was in exile for most of his life, or most of his active adult life, from the 1880s on and off. He was in Italy in the 1880s, on and off in the 1900s and the 1890s. But he was more or less in exile, so a very example of somebody in diaspora, example of this whole community of anarchists and syndicalists and others who are in diasporas all over the world. He started to develop this idea of, looking at the working class as opposed to peasant revolution. And he wasn't a worker. I mean, Brian Morris, in a recently kind of embarrassing exchange with John Clark, an anarchist studies I'm involved in, called him a working class bloke. But he wasn't a working class bloke. He came from the kind of southern middle classes. His parents owned a tannery. He and his brother were in medical school at the University of Naples. So that's pretty high up in Italy at that point. And they dropped out. And he, kind of declassed himself like populists did in the Narodniks in Russia. And he learned the trade. He learned the trade of electrician, which was like a kind of, learning to be a computer programmer or a coder in 1960, because he did the 1870s, and the gas fitter. So he did work as a working class person, but he wasn't from a working class background to begin with. He had a much higher level of education than most working class people would have to begin with, so to speak. And then he was a journalist in all these famous newspapers. And of course he was worried that this would become a career in itself, and that's why he also wanted to work with his hands. He had this firm idea that you want to create this elite of ex-workers and intellectuals who, Bakunin said, it would create a new dictatorship. So he was one of the first people actually to introduce the concept of syndicalism, although he didn't believe in it as an ideology, in the 1890s. He lived in London, by the way, for almost 30 years on and off, from the 1880s to 1919. And he, when he was in London in the 1890s on and off, many French anarchists came here because of the fact they had to flee France because of the repression of anarchism in France with the terrorism which he opposed. And that's when he converted, so to speak, many of the people that became the lead players in French anarchism, Pelloutier and many others. And what inspired him was actually British trade unionism. So this is an example. He saw the general strike of dockers in London, which more or less brought London to a halt, and therefore brought to halt one of the nerve centers of the British Empire, as an example of what is a good form of trade unionism, a kind of unionism of the unskilled and semi-skilled. And so he said, this is what we have to do. These insurrections don't really work. We have to go back and organize within unions. But by the 20th century, as you said, he thought it had taken on a life of its own. He didn't believe it as an end in itself. He said that any organization could create an elite. So this is like what we hear from Occupy and onward, the idea of circulation of people. Otherwise, you have a leadership being created. He said if you are going to join a trade union, then what you should fight for in ginger groups is limited pay for the leadership, rotation of leadership, grassroots democracy, which has been used by many different movements over the last 100 years, which are openly anarchist. And he also, and by the way, he lived in Islington, so he lived up for most of the time up in Upper Street, and he had a workshop in Duncan Terrace, which is sort of catty-corner to where Boris Johnson now lives. So that used to be a famous slum, Islington, and of course, if he had kept it and carried on to his great grandchildren, be extremely wealthy. But anyway, I don't think he even owned it; just rented it out. But nevertheless, he was, he had his workshop there, and he was involved in bits of the British trade union movement. He was involved in various things. I'm just cutting this short just to give you examples. For instance, he was involved in a movement of waiters who were Germans, Italians, and French usually. Familiar if we think about who works in restaurants these days, who had a hierarchy, and in some ways the Germans are on the top and so on and so forth. But they had a system, and you see this is where the tips that they collect. This sounds very familiar. The tips and salary were collected by the owners of the restaurants, and he worked with this caterers union to stop this abuse, which of course was done here a few years ago. So curious kind of weird parallel there. He also, of course, was very acutely aware of the division of the working class and the poor between very different levels. That is to say, being an Italian, he was, of course, very aware of the Italian working class and going to Argentina and the United States and being treated terribly at this point, and understood that quite well, having traveled there as well, and to Cuba and New York and New Jersey. And in London, what he did was he became very friendly with Rudolf Rocker, who was a Gentile German anarchist from anarchists who lived in the East End, who became the leader of the Yiddish-speaking anarchists. I mean, he was a Catholic from the Rhineland, and he learned Yiddish, which was very difficult, German. And by the way, I mean, Emma Goldman, that's why all these Jewish anarchists in New York around Johann Most, because of the German, her first language was German and Russian, not English, and Yiddish. And so anyway, he was very close to those people, and they organized a fairly massive trade union or organization in the East End, at least for a few years, of the Jewish tailors of the East End. Now he knew the Italian tailors of the West End, who were much higher up the pecking order. They were bespoke tailors in the West End. So there was a famous strike in the East End of these Jewish tailors led by Rocker and others, and he got the tailors in the West End to exercise a form of solidarity. So that's another example of something which is quite familiar today, I think, in some ways. And the third thing was his worry about this kind of apolitical jingoism, which he observed when he was living in London during the Boer War, and also he went to the United States during the Spanish-American War. It was happening at the same time, and of course then he saw it in Italy, a few years later during the Libyan War, and then the rise of fascism. So he saw that there was an attraction for some workers towards extreme forms of nationalism, and he wrote about that as well, which I think is quite relevant today with Brexit and all the rest of it. So his aim, and I'll finish here, was basically, and I think you said that already, by the way, he was a friend of Tom Mann and George Lansbury. He knew all these people at the turn of 1910, 12, 14, when he was almost deported. They stopped it because, they organized the campaign. I won't go into the reasons why he was deported, but it's got something to do with the siege of Sydney Street, which you may have heard of. In any case, two more connections which I think are relevant. With Tom Mann, he endorsed what Tom Mann called was the Industrial Syndicalist Education League, which was the idea that you don't create separate syndicalist unions, because then you just divide organization. It's easier against each other. He said, these organizations should be within any trade union, and promoting these libertarian ends of rotation of leadership, low salaries for leaders, reasonable demands that don't get you tied up with militarism and things like that. He really kind of objected to the fact that the Italian syndicalists organized people who were manufacturing cannons. I mean, that was one thing he wasn't particularly happy with. So he thought the ends and means were important. He opposed the syndicalists who said that women should leave, who were telephonists and telegraphers during the First World War, and men were fighting, and then they wanted their jobs back. And he wrote an interesting article about that. So, in any case, that was his connection with Tom Mann. The other thing I'm finishing with is this weird connection with, not directly but indirectly, with Hillel Belloc and this argument about a servile state, which was argued before the First World War. And this, that's those right-wing libertarians, not left-wing libertarians, but nevertheless, he could see the idea, and it really does foreshadow ideas of the 1960s and 70s, the idea of a corporate welfare state buying off a section of the working class against the poor and maybe in America people of a different color. And that's what he argued about there. He turned this argument around to something which the American and other new lefts talked about in the 60s and 70s, and it kind of, I guess, has been returned now. But I think the important point about him, finally, is that he didn't want to just restrict trade union organization to organize skilled workers. And in an era today when the composition of the working class and people who work is so diverse, I think some of his ideas are quite relevant today, because he didn't emphasize this idea of this one class of people you look at. He understood, for instance, during the rise to fascism, he warned, and this is kind of like with Brexit, he warned at that point the Italian Socialist Party in 1919, 1920, which was extremely left-wing, at least in rhetoric, wanted to socialize all the land of the large landowners around Bologna and elsewhere, because they had giant trade unions, I mean really immense trade unions of landless laborers, and they said that these all should be socialized. And he warned that the only thing you're going to do with that, if you instant socialization of the land, that you'll alienate all these small peasants who live in the same area. And he said this will sow a whirlwind, and he was quite right, because the really origins of Italian fascism was not in the cities, but in the Po Valley, among this war between the poor, basically, the poor and maybe the slightly poorer, which, of course, the fascists used to their own advantage. So I'm thinking, of course, today with the struggle over Brexit, in a certain sense, is the same problem. Elements of people who are poor and poorer fighting over this illusion about Brexit, which is just a kind of illusionary battle. So in that sense, I suppose he's still relevant. I guess I could figure out some other things he's relevant about, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In response to what Carol said there, or what have you? Have you got any thoughts on what Carol said that you want to feed back on, or what have you?
I think the only sort of contrasting element that I point to when I read Malatesta is that I think he does occasionally sort of say that revolutionary syndicalism, and I think he's thinking of at some points of the French CGT and other points of the Syndicalist Union in Italy. He does occasionally say these are slightly, no, not slightly, these are much closer to us in ideas. But he also says, in contrast, that all labour organisations are likely to degenerate.
Yeah, it's Robert Michel's, basically, the theory of the oligarchy. Definitely. That's why I'm saying that this is actually what all this all these arguments around Occupy, or what David Graeber talks about, all this stuff he was talking about it then. The idea of how do you the true anarchism is small a anarchism, which promotes a form of grassroots democracy, to make it a long story short, which is what Graeber goes on about. And basically that's what Malatesta was talking about. The most important form of anarchism isn't anarchism with a capital A, even the ideology of anarchism, but that anarchists who are large A anarchists should promote small a anarchism. And certain movements that look like they're very reactionary can turn the other way. I mean, if we look at the yellow vests in France, on the one hand, I think sometimes I think they shouldn't be yellow vests, but brown or black vests, to be honest with you. But on the other hand, I can see why I saw the trade unions and others like were engaging with them, which is what you have to do. Exactly what Malatesta said in 1919, that you have to engage with people's worries if, they're actually from the same background, and they have to be all slightly higher, but, certainly not people with immense wealth or power or good life chances, so you cannot be sectarian about it. It's a very difficult balancing act, to say the least, but it'd be interesting to see what he said about those things if he was alive. What would Malatesta do in France today? Yeah, but anyway, yeah. So I think small a anarchism is what he tried to promote. This is like Colin Ward would talk about, spontaneous, or Kropotkin for that matter. And there's always this because of course you're right, when he had his own anarchist organization. He promoted an anarchist socialist organization in the 1890s, and then between 13, 14, and then when he came back finally in 1993, he did do that. But there was always a tension between that and saying, let's look at this sociologically. What's happening people don't have to read books. How are they performing? How are they reacting to their environment?
Okay, I put a slightly different gloss on it. I remember Malatesta sort of writing, people need to be active for themselves without waiting for any organisation to tell them what to do. But he also, I think, prioritised within his own mind that the formation of anarchists was his key activity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in the same way, the same way that something entirely different, somebody he actually disagreed with, William Morris said the same thing. As something making socialists, he would say making anarchists, but that wouldn't mean, like Morris, who gave thousands of speeches. He wasn't sectarian about it. And he wasn't actually doing it as a way of, in a kind of opportunist way, to win people over, to his. He didn't mind if people didn't join the anarchist movement. He just thought he thought that anarchism was a manifestation of certain activities by social movements. That was. But it doesn't have to have. You don't have to have read books about it. You just do it. Yes, but on the other hand, yes, he did agree with that. He wasn't somebody who said, "I don't want to be called an anarchist" or anything like that. That's certainly not the case.
I think his sort of insistence when he talks about general strikes that you have to prepare for violence.
Yeah, well, that's true.
This is not smaller anarchism. This is we want power, and we have to prepare for power, and the only place where people are going to prepare for that is not in labour organisations, which are legal organisations, but possibly in illegal organisations which are prepared to take on these problems. So again, if you look at actually what he did, for instance, that Red Week, which you mentioned in your book, which was this kind of movement against militarism in Italy after their invasion of Libya, which mushroomed into a near revolution, which split Italy in half for about a week in June 1914. The people behind that were, yes, the anarchists, the syndicalists, and Republicans, left-wing Republicans, who wanted an institutional change to a republic, not to the Savoy monarchy. So he was well prepared to organize on that level. And again, it's back to this tradition of the Risorgimento, that you have that this idea of actually overturning regimes is not an alien concept in Italy in his own lifetime. So, of course, that's a 19th century European thing, establishing secret organizations to manifest all of this. But I think he was realistic enough to realize that, especially in a place like Italy, there weren't enough anarchists to do it. So he certainly did have to go far beyond that. And also, at a certain point in his life, he also never understood this revolution as an anarchist revolution, i.e. that you seized power and established anarchy. What he said is you have to form a coalition with other parties of the left and form a post-revolutionary regime, and will be a kind of like
loyal opposition or something like that. I mean, in the way that lots of Spanish anarchists felt in 1936. I mean, there's that of course about leads to problems and all the rest of it, but that's the way he's very, he's tactically and strategically very interesting in that respect.
Yeah. So open up to questions from the floor. Lovely. Right, so we're going to open up for questions from the floor. A couple of wee details I mentioned first earlier is that the talks in here will be occurring on the final Thursday of the month. So if you don't know what's actually happening, at least if you turn up here on the final Thursday, you'll know there will be a talk anarchy related, unless Housmans really need the venue for somewhere else. Also, the discussion tonight is being recorded audio by Simon over there. So, and thanks, he's doing it entirely by he's doing it because he's just an enthusiast. He's doing it entirely unpaid and all the rest of it. So thanks, Simon, very much for that. So if you don't want your questions recorded, please do say it. We'll just cut that bit of the conversation out. But has anybody got any questions just now? Maria?
I don't know if it's anything to do with what we're talking about in terms of the beginning of the 20th century. But I was talking to a friend recently about it's vitally important that anarchists organise today, and their response to that was that the hierarchical organisations were vitally important because there isn't enough time because of climate change.
Right.
That things have got to be put into place pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And there isn't enough time for the effort to organise from an anarchistic point of view. And my response was, yeah, but that just perpetuates things.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I don't know. Not sure how to answer that. I mean, I guess I would answer it this way, that the most effective, I mean, the problem is there have been very quick, very effective movements that have come out of nowhere, societies, which are then taken over by people who do believe in hierarchy. So we can start with the Russian Revolution itself, which was not organized by Bolsheviks. It was organized by women and soldiers, basically, who created from Soviets and councils, again, small a anarchism when it came down to it. Now, of course, why it developed into something else is another story. More interesting, I suppose, in the 50th anniversary of 1968, the Paris movement is a very good example of a movement which no one could have predicted. I mean, 6 weeks before, at the beginning of 1968, Le Monde famously said, France is boring, nothing ever happens here. With de Gaulle now, the end of Algeria, with this boring people now. And, out of nowhere, this movement of 10 million people occupying, all the petrol ran out. It was, de Gaulle went off to Baden-Baden to make sure the army was in, so he had to release all these OAS people who tried to kill him because he wanted to make sure the army would stay on his side. They might do something for their own ends, but so that's an example, that really blew a hole in either Marxist or functionalist sociologist conceptions of revolution. I mean, without that kind of spontaneous wave, which happens every 50 years or something, then taken advantage of by other people, or maybe not taken, maybe you think it's a good thing, whatever, it wouldn't have happened. So the phenomenon of revolution in the world, in many cases, not always, but certainly in these cases, is based on not a form of spontaneity, but unpredictability. These hierarchical people who predict we're going to do this and do that. It doesn't work. Sometimes it works, but these are examples of cases where it did. And then Occupy and the Arab Spring. Now, of course, what happened afterwards, we know it didn't last. And then you can say, then they should have created this and that and that. But the point is, there wouldn't even be an opportunity for it to create anything if they didn't have these spontaneous mass movements who create their own logic, which actually lots of sociologists and historians are not quite interested in. Even if they don't, they realize there's something there. How are they going to explain these things without understanding? And that, of course, is something that Malatesta talked about a lot, about movements that could even appear reactionary, then turn revolutionary overnight. Like the example he always likes to talk about is the French Revolution, where they're going out and praise, talking about the king to help them because they're starving, and then turning around and starting a revolution. So, or Father Gapon or anything like this, and just similar examples.
You look like you want to respond to that, Tony.
Yeah, just one of my favourite quotes from Malatesta is where he says, we need to be ready, we need to prepare for things, because if we don't prepare for things, other people will do it and do things which we don't like. So maybe that's a form of leadership or organisation, maybe it's a form of collective leadership, of self-managed leadership or self-managed preparation, that he's not, he believes that things don't entirely work unless you prepare for them. So
yeah, that's true. I mean, certainly, if you look at the network of people he knew abroad and in Italy, they were preparing for these things, but he was preparing it on the basis that it shouldn't be monopolized by one cause, and that actually they should encourage this form of spontaneous, non-sectarian form of action. And so that, there's a kind of preparation there. Now, the problem, of course, and he realized it towards the end of his life, was that if he's going to call himself an anarchist, then there is no way you could create, if you're in a society which is, still has scarcity or still has to fight somebody else or whatever it is, ultimately it's not going to be anarchism, it's going to be a form of very libertarian socialism, whatever you want to call it. And that's why he always said that after, we're not, 1919, 1920, he didn't say the anarchists are going to make a revolution in Italy. They're going to support those elements in other parties that want to, and make sure that whatever they create afterwards will not be too dictatorial and will be based on grassroots democracy. So if you're not, you can't be an authoritarian anarchist.
Tony, you look like you're bursting to say something. Can I just get one more question? Get one more question for the audience, and then you can hold the thing and get back on that one.
Hello, sorry, it might not be very well articulated because I just thought of something that I've not thought of before listening to this, and I was thinking about the relationship between little a anarchism and big A anarchism, and then what is the role of big A anarchism in terms of ideology and pedagogy and propaganda and so on, and how it sees itself. And I think in a sense, like a lot of anarchist ideology / pedagogy / whatever big A anarchism sets out to do is spreading anarchism as an ideology, I suppose, in terms of non-hierarchy and so on. But maybe it should have a role as, when you were talking about democracy and small A anarchism being democracy, I was thinking more about sort of critical pedagogy and things as kind of producing knowledge from the bottom up, and how do you spread that? And I was thinking, what kind of knowledge needs to be produced? Is it a knowledge of how to organise non-hierarchically? And I thought maybe that does just happen a lot. So maybe the knowledge that needs to be produced is the knowledge of how to resist recuperation and resist co-optation into a capitalist, back into capitalism, back into the state, or how to prevent being oppressed. And I'm just wondering if that's ever been, if Malatesta spoke about that, or if that's something that has been talked about.
Yeah, he did, but I think more to the point with something like Kropotkin and more recently Colin Ward. I mean, that's what they were talking about. That actually, and sometimes Malatesta would criticize Kropotkin for being too naive, I must say, but and too scientistic. But Kropotkin's entire work is based on this concept of mutual aid. That mutual aid exists in biology and in human society, and that is the and altruism too is the other thing he talked about. And those are the fundamental bases for any kind of conscious libertarian, socialist, or anarchist society. But he says people do it without realizing what they're doing, and then he gives you examples of it. And that's what Colin Ward did through his life, with education, with venture playgrounds, with whatever, blah, 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 blah. Now, of course, that's why I think you're right, that Malatesta would say they're slightly naive here, that there's a bit more to do here than just identify spontaneous forces. That's why he disagreed with Kropotkin.
Yeah, again, one of my favourite quotes from Malatesta concerns ideas of leadership, and this takes us actually into the 1920s, where he's responding to the ideas which are contained in the platform, that is to say the document produced by Makhno, Met and their colleagues, the organisational platform of libertarian communism. And he argues that you cannot have a leadership that dictates, but you can have a leadership that educates, or that tries to draw people's experience to educate themselves, to learn from their own experience. So he does have a view of leadership and pedagogy. I mean, I'm not too clear on that.
Yeah.
Going back to the question about forms of organisation, I think when he talks about socialists and anarchists and republicans coming together, he says groups of friends should talk and decide amongst themselves how to act. Now this isn't quite the same as the concept which would be labelled in Russian the Soviet, but it's not too far away from that, and I think in terms of organisation, that's a different model of how you organise collective and participatory politics, and I don't think it's something that's actually absent in Malatesta, but it is present in other anarchists, for instance with Rudolf Rocker, who would argue that the councils should be the predominant form of political organisation and nothing should be above councils.
Right, before it goes on, I'll just ask another couple of questions for opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Just wanted to say that Rihanna Perth is actually good for one of the futures, because she's going to be doing, she's done an afterword for what was the title of the book again?
Sorry.
It's a book by Marie-Louise
Berneri, yeah, A Journey Through Utopia.
A Journey Through Utopia. So Rhiannon has written a lengthy afterword for it, and once PM Press get it out, we will have Rhiannon to do a talk on it. And also, this the current edition about anarchist studies has got some stuff on Marie-Louise Berneri as well. Now, questions from anyone? I've seen Tony first, and then can go to you, and then we can. Nick, Tony. Oh, actually, all sort of ways of Tony or Nick.
Yeah, going back to where you started out, Tony, syndicalism, and it was said that there was great criticism of these various socialist parties and their attitudes towards mobilisation around war, things like that, yeah. But when it came to the crunch, both the syndicalists, apart from the great example of the FBGG, which you mentioned, the German anarcho-syndicalists, who opposed war from the beginning, they all caved in. Both the socialists and the syndicalists caved, and they took part in the war effort. And the problem, there were problems with syndicalism that people like Malatesta saw immediately. That when he was at Amsterdam, he quite correctly put forward all of these criticisms. At Amsterdam in 1907, he put forward these criticisms. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I just asked a question from.
Yes, hello. I was just wondering, you briefly touched upon women workers being replaced by men after sorts of large conflicts. I just wondered, could you just explain a little bit more, like, assuming the factory was an enlightened person and they had a number of women working a very skilled engineering role.
Yeah.
I'm always wondering how you get into war and these men, shell-shocked men come back, how they replace all these skilled women. How does that transfer happen?
Right.
And what's the union's position on that?
Was it where are you talking about?
Well, just sort of, say for example, say in London, for example, in any sort of European country, what what sort of generally the union's positions on
Well,
whether women should just
first
give
of
up
all,
those roles or not?
in the structure of a factory, I know this, with talking munitions factories largely here, the most skilled workers who had been there before the war were exempt, right? The ones who were really, and they were men. And and the women got skilled up to a certain level, but not to the very top. These men were exempt from the war, you know, unless they became, you know, too radical, and then that was the way of, you know, disciplining them. If you say too much, well, you know, you lose your exemption and you automatically get conscripted, which is what happened in Italy. In fact, they're sent to punishment battalions, i.e. shoved up the Alp first to be shot basically by the Austrians to get rid of them. So there were men in the factory who were directing these women who did all the kind of middle level and lower level work. The top still remained men, you know. So that wasn't the thing about. I think it is interesting with these, you know, telegraphers and telephonists, which later on, of course, did become a highly the telephonist being a highly feminized profession in many countries. But this was something which Malatesta wrote an article about, which I thought was amazing, you know, by 1920, where, and some of those people in these unions are actually on the left and pretty close to anarchists or syndicalists, and he said, no, you're wrong, you know, this is not what we're talking about, you know, I disagree with this entirely, along with these people in the factory of manufacturing cannons. That was the other one I didn't like, which is organized by syndicalists. So that's the way it worked. I mean, they were still, the most skilled people were still there, and at the end of the war, you know, there was a mass campaign in most countries to allow these men to go back to what was their jobs, as they would put it, and women were forced out of the factory through legislation and otherwise.
So the factory had to replace its skilled people with people who.
Yeah, I'm not saying there weren't. I mean, the ones that. Well, it's a complicated business because skilling changed in the First World War to some extent because they want to have mass production. So the most skilled people were men. They weren't women. But the middle level, semi-skilled people were women. And they mixed with young boys, you know, actually became very radicalized. People did become very radicalized.
But they were generally forced out.
Yeah, they were forced out at the end. By legislation or through other means in all countries in Europe and the United States.
Do you want to pick up anything, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, earlier the French CGT actually tried to exclude women.
Yeah.
In many parts of many of its branches or syndicates were unsympathetic to them.
Yeah.
So responding to your question about syndicalism, yeah, there's a problem with syndicalism. Personally, I like to think of syndicalism as a family, not as a one sort of tendency. So there are different forms of syndicalism in different countries with different experiences, and there is also evolution. There's a difference between ideas. So theoretically, the CNT in Spain had a progressive line on women, but it didn't necessarily implement it or practice equality. Even in many of the textile workers' unions, I believe, where there were a majority of women, the organisation was in the hands of men. There is evolution. There is the different types of priority between one form of syndicalism and another. And the CGT split. You had anti-war and pro-war elements within the French CGT. The Italian syndicalists expelled a minority which went on to support the war.
That's right. And then many of them went on to become fascists, but not all of them were then turned on fascists. It's a complicated story.
Do you know one of the wee details I liked? I mean, I liked the book, and what I really liked about it was tons of intrinsic wee details that I think were really, really useful.
Yeah.
I liked the way that you pointed out the injustices that women experienced at several points, and I thought that was really, you know, absolutely necessary, and I thought, you know, good on you for that. Anyone got any questions or what have you?
I spoke with my sister in Germany yesterday, and she asked me, what is happening to this country? Where is it going? I didn't know how to answer her. You've already touched upon this, which I really liked, that fascism was started in the poor valley, among the poor, and the very
not
poor,
only, but yeah,
and the parallels which we now see with Brexit. Would you mind highlighting that actually?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just
What's your
trying to
take on
say that somebody like Malatesta didn't, not being a Marxist, I think he was more sensitive, although not completely sensitive, to the motivations of people being divided for other reasons, and he certainly understood the influence of nationalism and racism, and so that's what I was talking about. In terms of Italy, he's just talking about the fact that it's like a war amongst the poor. I mean, that you have people who just got their land, small peasants, got their land because of the First World War, because of the inflationary spiral. They were able to get their land, and they had a little piece of land, and then you have these vast amounts of people who are only employed 6 months a year, landless laborers, who are told that we're going to socialize everything. Not only the large latifundia, but these small little patches of land. And so those people who were mobilized in the fascist squads that actually did the violence, that destroyed this whole network of socialist and some anarchist people's houses, I mean, the kind of popular centers, a really rich network of social institutions which were just put to the torch. Now, of course, they also had the help of middle and upper middle class officers from the army, young men, professionals, students, who were all on the right back then, by the way. And there was a combination of those two, like you have in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, towards the end, the combination of these two forces. So Malatesta was conscious of that, the way that many very, let us say, sectarian Marxists didn't understand that this could possibly happen. In fact, these people he was arguing with were the Marxists, the Italian Socialist Party, was their major plank, was the socialization of the land, and not the cooperatization of the land, not the land being taken over and created by cooperatives of the people on the ground, but the socialization of the land by the Socialist Party, top down. And that was one of the reasons that, that fascism got its territorial hold and then got into the cities. I mean, it was always in the cities fighting, but couldn't control the cities. It was almost like Maoism, surrounded the cities and took them over in 1921, 22. And he saw that happening, which was the only other person who wrote about this was Angelo Tosca, who wrote a famous book, The Rise of Italian, friend of Gramsci's, who also saw this happening in his famous book about the rise of fascism. So in that respect, they were far more advanced than many Marxists. You get later critical Marxists to do this, but he has wrote very interesting things about, and warned. I mean, when it was happening, saying this is you're gonna have hell to pay if you continue down this line, socialists. So that's what I was talking about, and the idea about Brexit too being a kind of war between the poor in some ways, between people in Sunderland who are from a kind of working class background, and then the new working class of London, as young people who are in gig economy. They're not, they're also, but they're for Brexit. They're not for Brexit. So this Brexit thing becomes like land socialization. It's very explosive. It's very possible to mobilize a populist movement, a violent populist movement, like you saw in the, in the early 20th century. That was my comparison. I think it's quite worrying.
Questions from anyone? Any thoughts from anyone? Contributions?
Go for it. I'm just wondering about organisation of a congress or something like that a very long time ago. How do you put something like that together all around the world and get people on the move to turn up?
Or this one in Amsterdam.
Yeah, how do you do that? And it's difficult enough getting people into a bookshop on a Thursday night, let alone having thousands of people pinging around the world when there's no internet.
That's true.
And so there's that. And then outcomes. Were there any outcomes and were they achieved? I mean, so, how do you put it together? How does everyone get there? And what were they supposed to do when they left? There was preparation and bulletins circulated before the Amsterdam Congress. The Congress brought together some federations. There's an anarchist federation, for example, in Bohemia. There's a federation in Germany. Some of these, there's a federation in French Switzerland, and some of these organisations sent delegates on behalf of their federations. The Italian Federation had a congress shortly before the Congress in Rome, so they prepared deliberately for this. Similarly, in Belgium and in the Netherlands, there were anarchist federations of sorts. In fact, most of the participants were locals. There were more Belgians and Dutch than anybody else who came to the Congress. Some people perhaps prepared rather badly. The Spanish libertarians didn't manage to get there. There was nobody present from Latin America directly, although there was indirect representation from a guy in Rome. In addition to that, there were many newspapers and journals and media people. So somebody came from the Freedom newspaper in London. There were representatives of American publishing interests. Emma Goldman organised to raise funds from her friends and organisations in the States. So there was a mixture of individuals and organisations, some better organised, some not so well. There were also some people who stayed away. Galliani, an anti-organisation anarchist in Italy.
With his own organisation, of course.
Stayed away. Kropotkin didn't come.
He was quite old.
He was quite old and he was maybe too busy with other things. So it was quite interesting who came and who didn't. So there was quite a lot of preparation over a year or two, and actually there was preparations for another congress in London in 1914, which didn't happen because of the war. As to outcomes, there were two networks that were set up in Amsterdam. One, a network of syndicalists, which published a bulletin, and another International Anarchist Federation, or Bureau, which attempted to collect archives and to publish a newsletter communicating information as to what was happening within different parts of the movement. So
based in London.
Yeah. Rocker and Malatesta were involved.
And Shapiro.
In that.
Yeah.
There were 3 or 4 years later, but that didn't work out.
Yeah.
So there was a loose organisation, but not very cohesive.
This is really the flavour of the month or decade for anarchist social history, which is tracing networks by reading all their newspapers. There's a famous article, well, but lots of stuff, but an article in the International Review of Social History by Davide Torquato, who writes about Malatesta, but he wrote an article about Italian anarchism not even being Italian, but being global, based on its diasporas, which were political diasporas and labor migration, you know, in the big city of Buenos Aires and New York and so on. And what he did, and then lots of other people have done, somebody's done it for the Caribbean, Schaefer has done it for kind of anarchists in the Caribbean, sort of. He actually wrote an article like the Pirates of the Caribbean, Anarchists of the Caribbean, which was about Spanish-speaking anarchists. It's language-based networking. So you'd have, you know, these anarchists in Cuba who were quite active, and then they had their, you know, they connected with the Mexican anarchists, the Puerto Rican anarchists, you know, and then the Italians did the same thing in their language. Papers, London, Paterson, New Jersey, Alexandria, Egypt, and so through those networks of these papers that go on, and what they do is they look at who pays for, you know, sends donations, and you'll see people, for the Italian case, miners from Illinois or Barry, Vermont, the quarry quality workers at Caledonian, and then others in Egypt. I mean, you know, so it's global. Like today, you know, without the internet, what they did have is the telegraph, which it goes as quickly as the internet. It's electricity. So the telegraph, in some ways, is the Victorian, Edwardian internet. Although, if you're going to transmit things that are a bit sensitive, you wouldn't want to do it on a telegraph, to be honest with you. But nevertheless, it is a way of keeping things together. Telegraph, fast steamships, and these global newspapers, basically, which clearly were, you know, the ship from one place to another by people traveling, sailors, people on the tram, people who were exiles. And that's become a big hobby for many historians now, to trace these networks. Sometimes they get carried away with themselves, but this network, that network, this one. And that's the way this happened. It became like a network. It's almost like people try to draw parallels with the global justice movement and those kind of networks and all of that. You know, so they sort of feed on each other today for people who are interested in the history of it and know about the recent past. So that's the kind of infrastructure behind what Tony's talking about.
There's actually another person who's going to be doing a talk as well, and she talks about grave in
yeah, that's Constance Bantman.
Constance Bantman.
Yeah.
She's another person who's going to be talking
Yeah,
about it.
she
She's got a fascinating thing about the sort of networks in France and all that.
Yeah.
So that's definitely worth it.
Yeah.
So, anyone else? Go on. This is your opportunity. You don't get many chances to ask about Malatesta.
Most people don't want to ask anything about Malatesta.
Tony, do you have any final thoughts or what have you?
Well, I could add to what you said about networks. The IWW Sailors Union, Maritime Workers Union, spread anarchist ideas down rivers, around coasts.
Down the west coast of North and South America.
Yeah.
From California to
Chile.
Yeah.
There's also contacts across the Pacific between Australia and Chile.
Yeah, and also contacts between Chinese and Japanese anarchists and the west coast of the United States. There's a wonderful article by Kenyon Zimmer who writes about this, about San Francisco in about 1905, where you have this anarchist grouping of Chinese and Japanese anarchists coming to the United States, Mexican anarchists fleeing Mexico, and then anarchists from the East Coast who actually are immigrants, Italians or Jews coming that way. And then you have, you know, WASP anarchists, who are, you know, the hard rock miners who were in the IWW or the Western Federation of Miners, all coming together in this crazy cosmopolitan mixture. And imagine their networks. That's the entire world basically, and then they have their own newspapers and goes everywhere.
And in places like Hamburg as well, the IWW
any port city,
to German harbours like Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, and they spread the idea. In fact, I'd say that, you know, the idea of the IWW, you know, OBU politics influenced the development of the AAUD, you know, the councilist union, very that really related to who talked, you know, who talked about the IWW, and that there was a embryonic IWWs in those books, which sort of evolved into the AAUD and the FAUD, you know. And also, you know, there's influence even in places like Liverpool, you know.
Yeah, of course.
You got people like, you know, who later became like Jack and Bessie Braddock, who later became notorious Labour careerists, but who were then, you know, involved with the IWW, and, you know, Liverpool became a sort of inlet for IWW, spread of IWW literature and ideas through Britain.
Yeah, and the final example I would give, which is very romantic and lots of folk songs, which is people who were seasonal workers in the United States in the Great Plains in the West, who you know, rode the rails, the hobo jungles. That's where the IW got all their song. That's where they had the, you know, that was a major recruiting ground for you. You have to have your IWW card sometimes to get on a boxcar. They were the actual actually controlled by the IWW, the actual movement of people across the American West. That's an interesting that's a land network, not a sea network.
I think, I mean, I always remember Tony, I can't remember, was it Tony Brook? I can't remember his surname. The guy who did was it Mike Davis who did the thing about Boda's wagon? About the history of the carbon. And he was talking about, I remember attending a talk at ICA about this, and he said anarchists were very innovative and using whatever the most recent technologies were in new ways. And I think sometimes we can make myths about those things, but just listen to about how networks were used. And I'm sure other groups were doing exploiting networks as well. But we really brought that into great relief. Any other questions from anybody before we start winding this up? Yeah? You okay? Good. Any final thoughts from the floor?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, honestly, thank you very much for that. I honestly have never had such a three-dimensional conversation on this. And again, don't forget the Anarchist Festival. Check that online, anarchistfestival.wordpress.com. Hopefully the Autonomy Now website will be up fairly soon. It's amazing how often I've actually heard the name Malatesta used and nobody's actually explained it, actually given a rich narrative about what he was actually talking about. And for that alone, this has been an absolute gem. And Carl, Tony, thank you very much. That was an absolute delight. And do have a look at Tony's book. It's very worth it. I found it extremely useful.
No, I'm not going to say steal
and
that
don't
book.
forget Carl and Rihanna's going to be back here as
that.
well in the future. So final Thursdays of the month. That's all you need to know. Just turn up. Anyway, thanks again.